everybody, welcome back to Broken Brand. I'm your host Stuie. I just want to talk about one thing real quick, just because it's been floating around, and that's this new proposed uh, registration for podcast and streaming companies from Canada. And I know this isn't Canada, this isn't U.S., but let's talk about some of the implications that this may or may not have, and what it means for minuscule creators like myself and bigger creators that are here based in the States and in other countries, how this can affect other people and what this possibly means. So basically what it comes down to is Canada is going to push forward through this bill to have podcasting and streaming companies that make over 10 million annually register with the Canadian government. And they're just collecting information, registering with the government. Now, this sounds like, okay, what's the big deal? And honestly, on the surface, it doesn't sound like a big deal. Hey, so we want to know who's broadcasting in their area. Now, when they do this for TV and radio, this has a specific reason, and that is to maintain broadcasting radio waves and keeping certain channels and certain ranges and things like that. So, like, somebody just can't pop up a radio antenna, start broadcasting a radio station or a TV station, and knock out emergency service signals. That is a needed regulation. And that's kind of what the FCC does here. It just kind of keeps this range of signals, these frequencies and things like that for radios, for communications. It's just so there's no overlap. We don't get loss of emergency communications and things like that. Yes, and because of it, has grown out of it on broadcasting during certain hours. You can't say certain words or certain languages. And that's pretty much it. They haven't gone any farther than that in the U.S. that I'm aware of. But does it mean they could? Yeah, it does mean they can. Because if you don't comply with their rules, they can pull your license. You won't be able to broadcast on that frequency and things like that. This is the plus side of the internet. Don't have to worry about that. It's online. It's through the internet cable. There is no broadcast. It won't interfere with any emergency services or things like that. Any type of communication. This is a good thing. So, why is registration make me weary? Well, just for an example, registration of your vehicle, like here in the United States. We have to register our vehicles with our state. And what does that mean? Well, that means we have to register our vehicle so they know we pay taxes on our vehicle. Most states require that you have insurance when you register a vehicle, pass an inspection, and some states have pretty easy inspections, just safety inspections, like here in Texas. Some have deeper requirements, such as EPA emissions, and your vehicle can't spout out a certain level of exhaust. If not, you have to fix that. So there are those types of regulations. And I'm not saying these are bad regulations, but what I am saying is this does put money in the pocket of the government. So registration always leads to regulation. Almost always. And regulations, like we just pointed out, isn't always bad. You want to make sure people driving around have insurance, and so in case something happens, their vehicles are safe, so no one gets hurt in the vehicles. These are practical regulations. But they could say, like in California, well, if your vehicle isn't electric, now you have to pay an additional tax. And with adding broadcasters and not broadcasters, but internet service companies like streaming services, podcast companies, to register means eventually the government's going to make them pay a streaming fee or country streaming fee. This is my speculation. So Netflix, Spotify will have to pay a fee to the Canadian government, and the Canadian government can say, okay, if you're going to stream in our country, you can't stream XYZ. This could be a personality, this could be a show, movie, anything of that nature. Or it could be you can't broadcast any of these types of topics in our country. And you think, oh, that seems a bit far-fetched. We've got it in China. We have it in several other countries in Southeast Asia that are very authoritarian. We see this now in socialist countries. I mean, you can't say what you want in some countries. Not every country has freedom of speech like we do here in the States and other democratic nations around the world. So the problem is eventually will Canada put some regulation like that in place? Don't know. During this article that just kind of briefs through it, it's on cbc.ca. You can go check it out yourself. It just kind of gives an outline of what it talks about. But one of the law professors that they interviewed at a university said, yeah, they haven't put any regulations, but it's kind of, let me see if I can find it specifically. I think a lot of people will take a look at this and feel like it's a thin edge of the wedge and that more regulation on the way. It's a perspective echoed by Canadian podcaster Jesse Brown. They're signaling there's going to be regulation in this space, but not telling us what it is, and that makes it hard. Could this be that these podcasters, you think, oh, well, they're just going for these big companies. They're going for the big companies now, yeah. The tax on vehicles originally was held by the manufacturer, Ford, Chevy, GM, Studebaker, all those companies back in the day. They're the ones that paid the taxes for every vehicle that was produced. You pay taxes when you bought it, and that was it. Then they decided, no, we need more taxes, and they started adding those regulations in down to the taxpayer. And you either meet these requirements or you don't get to use your vehicle. So that's where this is. And no, this isn't a logical fallacy of the slippery slope. This is truly a pattern we've seen in government throughout time, throughout different countries, throughout different things. This is something to be concerned about because registration always leads to regulation. Now, and you're thinking, oh, well, it's not affecting, like the end user. Like me, if I wanted to watch a Canadian podcast show, I wouldn't have to pay or register. I'd just view it and watch it. This resides with that company. Yes, it does. But here's what the thing is, like a lot of smaller creators and larger creators are part of podcast networks. Like one that you're familiar with would be Spotify. They're considered a podcast network, among other things. But there are other podcast networks that, like, Joe Rogan is part of Spotify. There's other big creators like Bad Friends. They're part of another network that is a podcast network. This network as a whole probably makes that amount. And now if they put out those regulations may filter down to their personalities and their showrunners and their shows. And this is where it gets iffy. And here is the darker side. Now, companies like this can either do one of two things. They can follow the regulations in Canada and do something else for everybody else and just pay special attention to Canada. But these multi-million-dollar companies, it's going to be like, okay, we're running two things at once. And if you're familiar with the business world, simplification, and I hate to say the word, but synergy makes things easier and less complicated. So if Canada's telling we need to do this, let's do this across the board. Not just content we're shipping to Canada, but to the U.S., to Mexico, to Sweden, to Australia, to Korea. All these countries are going to fall under these regulations that Canada may set because these larger companies may say it's just too much trouble to have one set of rules for Canada and another set of rules for everywhere else. You're like, well, this doesn't really happen nowadays either. That's kind of an alarmist, but China is the example we need to look to. North Korea is an example we need to look to. Content flowing into those countries is heavy regulated on every possible platform, every possible source of information, to the point where there are Christian ministries that literally load USB drives and put them on balloons and float them into North Korea to get them TV shows and newspapers, just anything that they can get on there. There's ministries that do that. And just to get the people of that country aware of what's going on in the world. So we don't want to end up that dystopian. I don't think we'll probably end there. There'll be some sort of riot before that happens. But the fear is there's going to be some sort of regulation applying to streaming services such as Netflix, Disney, Hulu, Amazon, all that. Well, these multi-million-dollar companies, they're not going to sit around and waste money spending one regulation for another when they could just be wasting it on terrible content. That's just a poke at some of those companies that are turning out terrible shows after terrible shows. So this is just something you should be aware of. You should take a look at it. You should keep it on your radar. We should all keep watching it and keep following it and see where it leads. This is a thing that influences free speech, could influence free speech in Canada, and possibly influence free speech around the world. And I am 100% for free speech. I don't care if your ideas are stupid, crazy, insane, or whatever. You should be allowed to say them. Just as I'm allowed to say whatever I want to about whatever subject I want to. So, until there's an update, I want to just say this and this only. I love you all, and there's nothing you can do about it.